So good afternoon, everyone, again, and thank you for joining today's workshop on the use of the Economic Substance Filing Portal that was launched on 1st of December 2020. The online portal has been developed to allow businesses that fall within the scope of ESR to easily submit their notification, economic substance report, and supporting documents electronically. Before we begin today's demonstration of the Economic Substance Filing Portal and its key functionalities, we would like to take a few moments to first recap some of the critical amendments introduced by Cabinet of Ministers Resolution number 57 of 2020 and supporting guidance. In particular, we will cover the changes to the scope of the regulations, the new categories of the exempted licensees that were introduced, the treatment of UAE and foreign branches, and the deadline for filing a notification and economic substance report. Businesses can find a copy of the regulations, guidance, and supporting information on the Ministry of Finance Economic Substance webpage. This information has been developed to help businesses to understand the regulations and their requirements and provide practical examples and detailed guidance on how to complete the notification and economic substance report through the online portal that we will be demonstrating today. Thank you everyone for attending today's session. So now I will ask Yanis to please start the session. To you, Yanis.
Great, thank you very much, Asma, and welcome to everybody. So as Asma mentioned, we will first begin today's session with a recap of the critical amendments to the regulations. So these regulations, they initially were introduced in April of 2019 and went through a significant reform in early August of this year. Now, this reform introduced various critical changes that we will run through today. So if we could just move to the next slide. So what you can see on this page is that the actual administrative structure that underpins the economic substance regime has been altered. What we have now is that there is a new body, which is the Federal Tax Authority, who is empowered to be the national assessing authority that has a role to play. That role is to assess and determine whether the economic substance test is met. They will be there to manage appeals and impose penalties. What does this mean for you as a licensee? Well, as a licensee, there is no real significant difference between the original regulations and the new regulations. What you still need to do is make sure you submit your notification and, if applicable, your economic substance report on a timely basis, and you need to ensure that the information available therein is accurate. You may receive requests from the regulatory authorities and from the assessing authority for you to clarify or provide additional detail as part of either your notification or economic substance report that has been submitted. And if appropriate, you may seek to raise an appeal. That is the critical position for you as a licensee under these regulations. If we could move on to the next page. Now, I guess one of the questions that everybody asking is, what is actually a licensee? Now, previously, under the original cabinet resolution, a licensee had a very broad definition. That definition included all natural or juridical persons licensed in the UAE to carry out a relevant activity. This meant that the definition of a licensee could include branches, representative offices, and several other business forms, as well as natural persons here in the UAE who had a license and carried out these activities. Through the amended regulations, however, there has been a narrowing of the scope of this definition of a licensee. That definition is now focused only to apply to juridical persons, and a juridical person is a business that has separate legal personality from its owners, as well as also unincorporated partnerships that carry out a relevant activity in the UAE. Now, what does this mean, or what is an example of who's in scope and out of scope? Well, you can see here that the green ticks are next to a limited liability company, private shareholding company, public shareholding company, partnership, etc. Those all mean that they are within the scope of these regulations, provided they undertake a relevant activity. And we will get into what is a relevant activity shortly. The remaining 3 on this list, so a natural person, so an individual, a sole proprietorship, or a trust, they do not fall within the scope of these regulations. Now, another question that I'm sure many of you have had is, do these regulations apply to businesses that are operating in a free zone, a financial free zone, or even an offshore free zone? The answer to that question is yes, it does. These regulations equally apply to businesses registered onshore in the UAE and in any of the free zones, financial free zones, and offshore free zones, provided you undertake a relevant activity. The amendments to these regulations also included new categories of exempted licensees. So if we move to the next page. Now, an exempted licensee, what does this actually mean? So you can see here on the right-hand side that there are 4 types of exemptions that are available. These exemptions apply to a non-UAE tax resident entity, an investment fund and its underlying SPVs, businesses that are wholly UAE resident owned and only have UAE domestic transactions, e.g. they are not part of a multinational group, and also UAE branches of foreign companies that are subject to tax on all of their relevant income in a foreign jurisdiction. And I will work through each of these exemptions in a little bit more detail shortly. Now, if you are able to meet any of these requirements to be an exempted licensee, what does this mean? You still need to file a notification. And we will go through the process of filing a notification in the second part of this workshop. But principally, you need to file a notification and you need to provide the corresponding supporting information that evidences that you meet one of these categories of exemption. Now, if I work down the list, an entity that is a non-UAE tax resident entity, what this actually means is that a UAE corporate entity or UAE entity would need to be subject to corporate tax on all of its income that it earns from its relevant activity in a foreign jurisdiction, i.e. in a jurisdiction outside of the UAE. Now, being subject to corporate tax does not mean that you pay withholding tax in that foreign jurisdiction. No, this does require you to pay formal corporate income tax in that jurisdiction. In respect of an investment fund, and the amended regulations and supporting guidance do provide more detail in terms of what is an investment fund, but it itself and its entities through which the fund directly or indirectly invests can be outside of the scope of these regulations if you meet the definition of what is an investment fund. And we want to just make sure that the audience understands that there is a distinction between being an investment fund and having an investment fund management business, because an investment fund management business is one of the relevant activities. For entities that are wholly UAE resident owned or UAE entities with domestic transactions only, this means that the underlying entity is wholly and beneficially owned directly or indirectly by UAE residents. It is not part of a multinational group, i.e. it does not have any foreign related parties that are outside of the UAE. All of its activities are exclusively carried out here in the UAE, and the resident owners reside here in the UAE as well. Now, many of you may be wondering, what do we mean by UAE residents? In the context of ESR, a UAE resident is a UAE citizen or an individual holding a valid UAE residency permit that resides here in the UAE. The last category of exemption is a UAE branch of a foreign company that is subject to tax on all of its relevant income in a foreign jurisdiction. Similar to what we mentioned about a non-UAE tax resident entity, you would need to provide the corresponding evidence to support the fact that this branch has been subject to corporate income tax in that foreign jurisdiction. Now, the evidential requirements that underpin these exempted licensee categories, they are available to you in the notification guidance, and that is there and can be accessible from the Ministry of Finance Economic Substance webpage. And we will direct you to that as well when we go through an example notification. If we could go to the next page, please. Now, again, a key point to clarify and make sure that all businesses here that have branches fully appreciate and understand how do you treat your branches in the context of ESR. Now, again, previously, each individual branch was treated as a separate and distinct licensee. The new regulations, the new position here is that a branch is considered part of its head office or parent entity. And that is because there is no separate legal personality of the branch. What does this mean if you have a UAE company with a UAE branch? Well, you must file as a single licensee, so that UAE company would file, including the activities of itself and its branch, in a single notification, and if required, a single economic substance report. What this would mean is that when you prepare the economic substance return for the corporate entity, you would need to disclose the details of the branch, and that is a section that's included in the notification template. In respect of UAE branches of a foreign company, as you can see, the UAE branch itself is required to comply with the regulations, except in cases where the income attributable to the branch is subject to tax in the hands of the foreign head office or parent entity. Meaning, if you have a UAE branch of, for example, a German head office, if that German entity consolidates the income of that branch and subjects it to German corporate income tax, then that UAE branch is not required to be reported in the economic substance notification or ESR report. And then finally, and as mentioned earlier, a foreign branch of a UAE company. A UAE company does not need to report or demonstrate substance in respect of any of its foreign branches, provided that foreign branch is subject to tax, or the relevant income of that foreign branch is subject to tax in a foreign jurisdiction. And again, what does that mean when we're practically filing our notifications and our ESR reports? It means that if you have a UAE company who in itself does not carry out a relevant activity, but its foreign branch does, and that foreign branch is fully subject to tax, you will then not be required to report and file on that basis. Could we move to the next page, please? And as we mentioned, there are several relevant activities that apply or would bring a business here into the scope of the economic substance regulations. Now, there are 9 relevant activities, and these are listed on the left-hand side of the page. And for today's presentation, I will not be going into detail in each of these relevant activities. There is plenty of practical guidance, as Asma mentioned at the beginning, available on the Ministry of Finance webpage, in particular Ministerial Decision 100, that sets out very clearly some examples of what is in scope and out of scope for these different relevant activities. Now, the critical ask here in respect of relevant activities is that you need to look beyond what is written on your trade license or your commercial license and actually assess the day-to-day activities that is undertaken by any particular entity. Now, when looking at the day-to-day activities, this is where you need to apply what is commonly referred to as a substance over form approach to determine whether or not the entity undertakes a relevant activity. Now, a common question that we've heard is that if you undertake multiple relevant activities, do you need to file multiple returns? The answer is no. A single entity should report all of its relevant activities in a single notification and, if required, single ESR report. For example, the same entity would not file separately in respect of each activity. The other critical point to mention here is that whilst a business may undertake a relevant activity, whether or not it has to file an economic substance report in addition to its notification would depend on whether that entity has any relevant income derived from that activity. So if we turn to the next page, what you see here is that previously there was no definition of income or relevant income under the regulations. However, the amended regulations do make it clear that there is now a definition of both relevant income and gross income. And what you can see here is that the definition of relevant income is also inclusive of the definition of gross income. I won't read this out to you, but it is available in Ministerial Decision 100 for you to review and ensure and understand whether or not you have earned relevant income in the context of the economic substance requirements. Next page. What we wanted to take a moment here today is to focus on a critical amendment to the regulations in respect of the distribution and service center business. So previously, a distribution business would be caught within the scope of these regulations only where it purchased goods from a foreign connected person, it imported and stored those goods physically here in the UAE, and then resold those goods outside of the UAE, meaning the product flow had to come into the UAE and then move outside of the UAE for this business to be considered as having a distribution relevant activity as part of a distribution and service center. However, the amended regulations have broadened the scope of what is a distribution business. And now it only requires the purchase of goods or parts or materials from a foreign connected person, and then the resale of such component parts, materials, or goods to any party, whether they are located inside the UAE or outside of the UAE. Similarly, in respect of a service center business, the previous definition tied this back to in connection with a business outside of the UAE, but now the new definition of a service center business is such that it is simply providing services to a foreign connected person. And what we have on the next couple of pages are some illustrative examples of what is in scope and out of scope for each of these subsets of a distribution and service center business. So if we begin with a distribution business, and the definition is repeated at the top of the page, what you can see here is where you purchase from a foreign group company, so in this case, a foreign connected person, and then you sell these goods to any customers wherever they are located, Company A would fall within the scope of the distribution and service center business. Whereas if, and in the second example, Company B was purchasing goods solely from a third party, that in itself, and then the sale of those goods were to customers equally here in the UAE or elsewhere, that would not be within the scope of a distribution and service center business for the purposes of the economic substance regulations. And then if you go to the next page, please. And then in respect of a service center business, what you can see here is that it is only services that are provided by Company A to a foreign group company that are within the scope of these regulations. And putting that into context, if, and in the bottom left corner of this screen, you can see Company B that is providing services directly to third-party customers, that is not within the scope of the regulations. Equally, Company C that only provides services to UAE group companies, that also does not fall within the scope of these regulations. The critical point to take away here in respect of both a distribution and a service center business is that it requires you to have a transaction with a foreign group company, or what is referred to in the regulations as a foreign connected person. If we could turn to the next page, please. Now, on this page, what we have summarized for everybody are the different filing deadlines that would apply. Now, ordinarily, under these regulations, The notification filing deadline is 6 months after your financial year end, and the ESR report filing deadline is 12 months after your financial year end. But as you can see, with the launch of the economic substance filing portal that we will showcase very shortly, there is now a requirement for businesses that have a financial year end that begins or ends any time between 1st of January 2019 and ending 31st of December 2019 to file both a notification by 31st of December 2020 and their economic substance report by 31st of December 2020. So that is their standard case. If, however, there was a business that also had a financial year end that ended any time between, as you can see on the left side, 31st of January 2020 and 30th of June 2020, they would also be required to file a notification in respect of their second reportable period by 31st of December 2020. For those businesses that, for example, have a 1st of April 2019 through to 31st of March 2020 financial year end, they would only be required to file a notification by 31st of December 2020 and would only be due to file their economic substance report by 31st of March 2021. And then if we can go to the next page, please. So just some immediate actions and next steps for everybody on this call. And different businesses will be at different stages of where they are concerning their assessment of or reassessment of the economic substance regulations. First and foremost, businesses should be applying that substance over form review to themselves, to the activities they undertake, to determine whether or not they fall into any of those 9 relevant activities. If you do fall into any of those 9 relevant activities, you need to then assess whether or not you need to file, well, whether or not you meet any of those exemption criteria. And if you do meet one of those exemption criteria, so for example, you're tax resident outside of the UAE, then you need to ensure that you have collected the appropriate supporting information that would need to be submitted. The next step for all businesses that undertake a relevant activity is that you would need to file a notification on the economic substance filing portal by the deadlines that we've mentioned earlier. Now, we are aware that several businesses here in the UAE had previously filed a notification with their regulatory authorities in early June. For those businesses, you do need to refile on the economic substance filing portal, meaning you should file again through this system that we will show shortly. And then if required, so the final step, if you undertake a relevant activity and you earn income from that relevant activity, then you will need to file the economic substance report. Now, the economic substance report is a bit more comprehensive than the notification. There is more financial data involved in completing that. There is more data around the number of employees that you have. And all of that information is collected as part of the economic substance report, and we will showcase that shortly. One important clarification to make, and I'm sure this applies to several businesses here, if as part of your assessment or reassessment, you determine that you do not undertake a relevant activity, then there is no requirement to file a notification, nor is there a requirement to file an economic substance report. So just to repeat that, if you do not have a relevant activity, you do not need to file on the economic substance filing portal. Okay. Now, I think the one last point to make is filing is one part of the journey. In addition to filing, you do need to make sure that if you are required to have substance here in the UAE, that you have considered whether your business meets those requirements. So for example, does your business have appropriate staff here in the UAE? Is there an appropriate level of expenditure happening here in the UAE? Do you have physical assets like premises or office space available to you here in the UAE to undertake your relevant activities? Do you perform those relevant activities here in the UAE? Is the management of that company undertaken here in the UAE? These are all types of questions, qualitative and quantitative assessments that would need to be done by you to ensure that you can meet the requirements of these regulations. And now if we could move to the next page where we will begin a demonstration of the economic substance filing portal. And I think just one last point to note before I pass over to my colleague to take over and lead the next part of the session. If you filed a notification with your regulatory authority previously, so in June of this year, and that notification was to say that you did not have a relevant activity, then again, there is no requirement for you to file a notification or ESR report because you do not undertake a relevant activity. Okay, Roy, over to you.
Perfect, thanks Yanis. So as Yanis mentioned, in the next section, we're going to demonstrate some of the core functionality of the economic substance filing portal. And if you could just give us a few moments to switch over to the demo. Perfect. So to begin, we will show you how to access the economic substance filing portal. And first, you will need to go to the MoF website, which you could see on screen. From here, you'll navigate to the Ministry of Finance's dedicated economic substance webpage. Now on this page, you'll be able to find information to support you, including the regulations, guides, flowcharts, and FAQs. And the economic substance filing portal can be launched by clicking here. Now, as you can see, we've been redirected to the MoF login page. This is because the economic substance filing portal is only accessible to users that have a Ministry of Finance corporate account. Now, if you don't already have an account, you can easily create one by clicking on the Create Account button. And remember, you'll need to select corporate from the drop-down menu. Now, the economic substance filing portal will be linked to this account. So it means that any emails will be sent to the email address used here. Now, for those of you with existing Ministry of Finance corporate accounts, you can click the login icon in the top right corner of the page. And from here, you can type in your existing credentials and then navigate to the Ministry of Finance Economic Substance webpage. And then from here, we can click on the economic substance filing portal to launch the portal. Now, once you've successfully logged in as a corporate user, you'll be taken to the licensee dashboard. This dashboard is the main page that you will see every time you log onto the portal, and it provides an overview of the forms that you have been submitted along with their status. Now, all current submissions and any associated penalties or appeals will appear in the Submittals tab on the top left corner, while the History tab includes all items for historical periods. To begin a new notification or access one that you're currently working on, you'll need to press on the Send Notification on the right hand. And the licensee dashboard allows a registered MoF user to file on behalf of itself or on behalf of another company. So as an example, a group company. Now let's begin by submitting a notification. So as mentioned earlier, all licensees, including exempted licensees, must file a notification. Now this notification form is a smart form, which means that it adapts based on the responses to the relevant questions. In addition, all fields in the notification are mandatory unless explicitly stated otherwise. Now let's proceed with completing a notification for a fictional licensee. You'll notice that the notification includes question mark icons, and these provide additional guidance to help you respond to the questions. And one thing worth mentioning is that additional information can also be found on the notification guidance, which is available on the main economic substance webpage.
Yeah. And before we continue, I think just it's important to make it clear that the only place to file a notification or economic substance report is through the Ministry of Finance's economic substance filing portal. For example, there is no specific or different filing approach or mechanism for any authority registered in a free zone or a financial free zone or elsewhere. This is the only form that must be used.
Now, if you have branches that undertake a relevant activity, they can be reported in this section. However, for the purpose of this demo, we'll select no and continue on to the next section. Now, a licensee that wants to claim an exemption under the regulations is required to upload documents to evidence that it meets the requirements to claim this exemption. Now, as you can see here, when I select that the licensee is tax resident outside of the UAE, I'm required to attach supporting information and confirm the jurisdiction in which the licensee is resident for corporate income tax purposes. Now, details of the required supporting documentation are set out in the notification guide, which we will now show on screen.
Yeah, I think there's probably an issue using the incognito mode, but the notification guide, if you just go back to the FAQ page. That guide is one of the PDF attachments here. I believe it is the final one. And just don't worry about opening it, it's fine. What you have in that guidance is several sections that also clarify very clearly what are the documentary requirements that are needed in order to showcase what is the evidential requirements to be an exempted licensee. So in the context of a tax resident outside of the UAE, that would include a letter issued by the foreign tax authority or government stating that you have a demand to pay corporate income tax, or it may be a letter that confirms that you are a tax resident for that reportable period. That notification guidance does provide that level of granular clarity in terms of what you need to provide. In the context of a business that is wholly UAE owned, so a domestic business, it would require you to provide documents such as your shareholder register to showcase that you are only owned by UAE residents, evidence that those individuals are UAE resident, and perhaps some other financial data to evidence that you do not have transactions with foreign parties. If we can go back to the notification.
So for the purpose of this demo, we won't be claiming an exemption. So now that we've completed the notification, you can review the form before submitting. You also have the option of printing a copy of the notification by pressing Ctrl and P on your keyboard. If you leave the form before pressing submit, you'll also be able to return to the draft later by pressing send notification from the dashboard and continue where you left off. The information included in a draft notification will be stored for a period of 30 days. Now let's submit this notification by pressing send. And on a successful submission, you should see this acknowledgement appear on screen. And now you can also return to the main dashboard.
And before we just continue, I may just reshare my screen just to give the audience a view of the notification guidance, if that's okay. So this is the notification guidance. Apologies that the link didn't seem to work earlier, but this is what you are directed to when you click that link. You can see here that for every type of question, you have a bit of narrative here explaining and providing a little bit more detail to give you a steer and guidance in terms of what is the information being requested for each of those questions. And what we wanted to explicitly show earlier was the details around claiming an exemption, which is under section E. And you can see here, for a business that is wholly owned by a UAE national, UAE resident, these are the types of documents that would be needed to be attached to your notification to evidence your exempted status. In particular, what we've shown as well is that when you are claiming an exemption, you can attach up to 10 documents. So there is not, you don't need to create one consolidated PDF capturing all of the different documentary evidence that you may need to provide. You can attach separate files if that is preferred. I just wanted to very quickly showcase the link and the notification guidance before we continue. So thank you. I'll stop sharing my screen and then we can continue with the demonstration as planned.
So following the submission of the notification, you'll see that the system has automatically created an economic substance report based on the notification that was submitted. You can also see that the report includes a deadline for when it must be submitted. This deadline is calculated with reference to the reportable period included in the notification. So what this means is that you can only file one report per reportable period, and the report can only be filed if a notification was first submitted. Now, since the reportable period included in the notification was the 1st of January 2019 to the 31st of December 2019, the deadline to submit the report is 31st of December 2020, which you could see in the deadline column. Now you'll also see a progress code that indicates that the report is awaiting licensee reporting. And this is to indicate that you are required to take an action, which in this case is to click on the File Report button to start completing the report. Now, in the interest of time, we've pre-completed the report, but this has not been submitted yet, which means that you can access the draft by clicking on the File Report button. Now, similar to the notification, the ESR report is also a smart form, which means that it adapts based on the responses to a previous question. And it also allows you to access helpful guidance when you click on the question mark icons. Now, all information submitted in the corresponding notification would have been pre-populated into the report. Now, in this initial section, the licensee will be required to complete questions 6, 9, and 10, since they were not part of the notification form. But these questions seek to confirm the office space that's available to the licensee, if the licensee is part of a multinational group, and whether the licensee is wholly owned by the UAE government.
And I think while we're just continuing to the next section where we want to kind of showcase some additional information for you, just one important point to clarify here as well is if you submitted a notification and you're in the process of finding the economic substance report for that same period, so you're filing for the end of this month basically. Now, because this is the kind of, we're having to file both forms very close back to back. If you need to make an amendment to your notification because you've realized subsequently that you've included a typo or you've incorrectly stated an amount somewhere that is recorded, that is something that you can address through the economic substance report, and that is what some of the features that we're about to showcase become relevant. There is also, and we will touch on that as a separate part, which is there is also the functionality to request an amendment of either the notification or report. But for this initial period, if there is a change you need to make to your notification, it will be advisable to make that change in the ESR report as that data gets pre-populated. And then you can update us of those changes here. And I think, Roy, if you want to continue.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Yanis. Now, since the information carried over from the notification is editable, you'll be able to update any of the details in the report. So for example, if after the submission of the notification, you identified a mistake in the basic information provided. Now, if you do change any of the information that was pre-populated, you're requested to select yes in question 1 on screen. And this is to indicate that a change was made and explain in the free text box what was changed. Now, since in our case, we didn't make any changes, we're going to select no and move on to the next section. Now, similar to before, if you identified after the submission of the notification that you carried on an additional relevant activity, you can add this relevant activity in the economic substance report. You will be required to select the relevant activity from the list on screen and then select yes to question 3 to indicate that a change was made. You'll also be required to explain what was updated in the free text box. However, sorry, Yanis.
That's okay. Just before we continue, Matt, if you don't mind just clicking lease finance business, just to show the audience how quick and easy it is to indicate a new relevant activity. And then if we were to press next and submit on this basis, you would see that on the left-hand side of the screen, we now have an additional section to complete, which is in respect of the lease finance business. But we can undo this change just for the purpose of this demo. And that also just re-indicates the smart functionality of the ESR report form that has been developed.
And just one final thing to add here before we move to the next section is that for the purpose of this demo, we are selecting that we do use an outsourcing provider. Now, as you can see, because we indicated that the licensee used an outsourcing provider, we're required to include details of the outsourcing provider in this section. As you can see here, licensees are required to attach standalone financial statements to support the information that they provided in this report. If the licensee does not have audited standalone financial statements, then you can upload the licensee's management accounts.
And the critical point to note here is that it needs to be standalone, i.e. for that licensee only. You are not taking consolidated financial statements. You are providing financial statements or numerical information that is solely related to the licensee. If we want to just continue.
Now, similar to what we saw in the notification, you can also print a copy of the report by pressing Ctrl+P. You could also leave the page and access your draft report later by clicking on the File ES report in the dashboard. And the draft report will be stored for a period of 30 days. Now, let's proceed with submitting the report. And once this has successfully been submitted, you should see this acknowledgement appear on screen.
Now, because we're using a demo environment, you would see that we got logged out of the system. Ordinarily, you would just go straight back to this page directly, and you'd see here that the progress code for the ESR form has been updated to showcase that it's been received as of today. And then you have some new functionality that Roy will continue to explain.
Yeah. Now, as Yanis mentioned earlier, if you realize that you made a mistake and you need to amend a previously submitted notification or report, you can easily do that by clicking on the Request for Amendment button on screen. Now, as you can see, since we requested for an amendment, the button has now disappeared. And when this happens, your regulatory authority will be notified that you have requested to amend your submission, and then they will make the decision of whether to approve or deny this request. Now, if we can just give the dashboard a few seconds to update. So as soon as your request for the amendment has been approved, your dashboard will be updated to show that you can now resubmit the form. So what you'll notice is that the title of this form has now changed to resubmission. And all the previously submitted information has now been pre-populated.
So what you can see while we're making a specific adjustment that's happening on screen now is, if needed, you could have amended any of the information that has been previously provided. But in this particular case, we've amended the amount of the relevant income generated from the headquarters business for this reportable period. And just before we continue, if we just go back page for a second. What you can see here as well in respect of the ownership information is, if you did indeed have a parent company and you needed to report that, you would simply just change the answer to yes, and then you would see the information that you would need to provide in respect of the parent company. So its name, its tax identification number in the jurisdiction in which it's registered, the address and the country in which that parent company is located. But for this particular example, we've indicated that there is no parent company, meaning this is the top entity in that chain. And equally, on the third item, we've also indicated that we do not have any ultimate beneficial owners, e.g., no individuals own 25% or more of the share capital of this licensee. Okay. And then if we just continue. You'll see here that we do need to repopulate the outsourcing information. That unfortunately doesn't carry over straight away in a resubmission, but it is thankfully just a very quick piece of information just to re-provide.
Now, one thing that you'll notice on screen is that uploading a financial statement during a resubmission is not mandatory, since it was already submitted during the original submission. But you will still have the option of uploading a financial statement. Now, when you're resubmitting a notification or report, you will be prompted to explain what changes you made and the reason behind these changes. Now, during the review of your notification or report, a regulatory authority or the federal tax authority may identify areas that they feel need to be amended or corrected, or which require further information. Now, in such cases, licensees will be notified by email that they're required to either resubmit their notification or report, or to provide supporting information. Now, this email will also include details of what is required from the licensee. One other thing is that you will be able to respond to such requests by either clicking the link in the email that you would have received, which we will see later in the demonstration, or by clicking on the resubmit button in the dashboard. Yeah. So as you can see, the dashboard has been updated to show that the licensee is required to to provide more information concerning its report. And you could see the particular query that the RA has raised in this case, which is to provide more information on the ultimate beneficial owner. Now, in this particular case, the licensee is confirming that they don't have an individual that owns more than 25% of the share capital of the licensee. And they're also attaching the shareholder register to confirm this. And as you can see, now that the additional information has been updated, the dashboard has been updated. We no longer have the button to resubmit. And just to mention, the same steps are taken when responding to a request for a resubmission from your regulatory authority or the FTA. So now that we've taken you through the key functionalities of the economic substance filing portal, we wanted to highlight a few additional features that are available to you. So if you click on the View Summary button next to a particular case, the licensee will have access to the full history of their submissions, including any communication sent by an authority. So if we click on this email, so this is the email that you would have received when a regulatory authority is asking you to provide additional information. And as mentioned earlier, the link in this email will give you access to providing this information. So rather than doing it through the dashboard. Now, through the View Summary tab, you'll also have access to the responses that the licensee provided. And if we can go back to the View Summary tab. Yeah. And one last thing to highlight is that the View Summary gives you access to a case number, which is necessary if you require any system support. Now, if you do require any help concerning a particular case, you can raise a ticket by clicking on the Help Desk banner, which you can see at the bottom of the page. Also, if you click on the FAQ on the same banner, you'll be directed to the detailed notification and economic substance report guidance, along with other helpful resources available on the Ministry of Finance Economic Substance webpage. And you can also get an overview of the functions described during today's session by clicking on Guide.
Yeah, so by clicking on the guide, it would take you to, ordinarily it would take you to a document that is available that sets out, you know, the different meanings behind the buttons and tabs that exist on the licensee dashboard for you to see and reference to, in addition to this recording that will be made available following the conclusion of this session. I think before we do wrap up and close, I think just a couple of key messages to reiterate. First and foremost, businesses should definitely take a substance over form approach to review and assess whether or not they undertake a relevant activity. Please do access the Ministry of Finance's Economic Substance webpage, where there is a wealth of information available to you to support you in understanding both the relevant activities and also your requirements. And as mentioned on that page, you will find helpful flowcharts. You will find guidance to the notification and ESR report that goes into, in some cases, a little bit more detail than what is the guidance available through the question mark icons on the electronic forms that exist. In addition to that, Ministerial Decision 100 does include a comprehensive relevant activities guide, and that relevant activities guide, as we mentioned previously, includes lots of examples in terms of what is within the scope or outside of the scope for any particular relevant activity. In addition to this, please bear in mind that for several businesses, there will be an immediate filing requirement for the 31st of December 2020 for both a notification and potentially an economic substance report. The way the licensee dashboard is developed and structured is that if you have a requirement to file an ESR report based on what you have included in your notification, then that ESR report will automatically be generated immediately after filing your notification. In other words, as soon as you file that notification between now and 31st of December, if you need to file that economic substance report, you can immediately do so. There is no need to wait. Further to this, just again, another reminder, these regulations apply to all businesses that carry out a relevant activity, whether they are onshore, in a free zone, in a financial free zone, or in an offshore free zone. And then lastly, just a final point to remember from my side before we close, we just wanted to again reiterate that only those businesses that have a relevant activity need to file a notification or economic substance report. If you do not have a relevant activity for this reportable period, then you do not need to file. And these requirements, just lastly, are year-on-year requirements, meaning you may fall into the scope this current year, you may fall out of scope next year, you may be in the scope each and every year, or you may currently not be within the scope for 2019, but you may have fallen into the scope in a later year and therefore will need to comply with these requirements. In other words, there is an ongoing obligation and requirement to stay familiar with these regulations and the corresponding filing requirements and ensure that you do file on time and provide accurate information, because there are penalties associated for failing to file and also for providing inaccurate information in your reports and notifications. I think with that, this closes the webinar for today. We thank everybody for their time and their attendance. As mentioned, this recording will be made available not only on the Ministry of Finance's dedicated ESR webpage, but it will also be shared with those that have registered to attend through the registration link that was shared previously. If you did not register, but you're accessing this recording either through Facebook or through other means, please provide your email address to the Ministry of Finance's dedicated economic substance mailing address, which is esinfo@mof.gov.ae. Just to repeat that, it is esinfo, all one word, @mof.gov.ae. Once again, thank you everybody for your time and your participation. Thank you, Roy. Thank you, Matt and Adrian as well, for navigating the dashboard in the background. And thank you for the ministry for hosting today's session.